All right, let's get straight to it. Today, we're doing a consultant-level briefing on a huge piece of modern compensation, restricted stock units, or, as you know them, RSUs. You know, whether you're on the receiving end of a job offer or you're the one designing the compensation plan, you absolutely have to understand the mechanics, the history, and the strategy behind them. It's essential.
Okay, let's do this the right way. Bottom line up front. So what are we talking about here? RSUs are company stock given to you as part of your pay. But there's a catch. You don't own them right away. There's this waiting game called a vesting period. Now, the huge advantage here, as long as the company stock is worth more than zero, your RSUs have value. That is a major, major difference from stock options. And here's the part you really got to pay attention to, taxes. The entire value of those shares is treated as ordinary income the moment they vest. After that, they're yours. Do what you want with them, sell them, hold them, just like any other stock in your portfolio.
So here's our game plan for today. First, we're going to nail down a solid definition. Then we'll get into the backstory. You know, why did RSUs suddenly get so popular? After that, it's a deep dive into the whole life cycle, from the day you get them to the day you pay taxes. Then we'll lay out a balanced view, the pros and cons, and we'll wrap it up by putting RSUs head-to-head with their famous cousin, the stock option. So let's start with the absolute fundamentals. What exactly are we talking about when we say restricted stock unit? Here's the thing you have to get right from the start. An RSU isn't actually a share of stock, not at first anyway. Think of it as a promise from your employer that they'll give you shares in the future. Full ownership only happens after you meet certain conditions, and most of the time, that condition is just time, sticking with the company for a couple of years. Sometimes, though, it could be tied to hitting specific performance goals.
The whole process really boils down to 3 distinct steps. First up is the grant. That's when the company officially makes you that promise. Step 2 is the vesting period. That's the waiting game, where you're putting in the time or hitting those goals. And finally, step 3, ownership. This is the big day, the moment the shares actually land in your account. That's when the promise becomes real, tangible property.
Now, how did RSUs become such a big deal in compensation packages? I mean, they weren't always this common. Let's dig into the strategic shift that really pushed them into the spotlight.
The story really kicks off in the mid-2000s. Remember those huge accounting scandals like Enron? Well, in the aftermath, regulators made a really critical rule change. For the very first time, companies had to treat stock options as an actual accounting expense on their books. And just like that, a huge advantage that options seemed to have just vanished, leveling the playing field and forcing every company out there to completely rethink their strategy.
And wow, this chart just says it all, doesn't it? Take a look at the data from Fortune 1000 companies between 2003 and 2005. It's stark. The number of stock options being granted plummeted by 40%. And at the exact same time, RSU awards shot up by over 41%. I mean, this wasn't a slow burn evolution. This was a massive strategic pivot across all of corporate America.
All right, let's get into our deep dive on the RSU lifecycle. This is where the rubber really meets the road. We're talking about the practical mechanics, how vesting actually works, and the big one, how you get taxed.
To make this super clear, let's follow a hypothetical employee M. So, they've been granted 1,000 RSUs with what's called a graded vesting schedule. As you can see here, after their first year, boom, 200 of those shares are theirs. They've vested. Same thing happens in year 2, year 3, and so on. This structure is a really powerful retention tool. People call them golden handcuffs for a reason, right? You're heavily incentivized to stick around for the full 5 years to get the entire grant.
And that brings us to what is probably the single most important question for anyone who gets RSUs. It's not just about the value on paper, it's about what you actually get to take home. So how does the IRS look at this whole thing?
Okay, if you remember one thing, remember this. The taxable event is the vesting date. Let me say that again. It's the vesting date, not the grant date. When you're first granted the RSUs, that's just a promise on paper, no tax consequences. The tax man only gets involved the moment that promise becomes real, the day those shares are officially your property.
This table breaks down the 2 key tax moments perfectly. So at vesting, the full market value of the shares you just got is added to your income for the year, and it's taxed just like your salary at your ordinary income tax rate. It's basically treated like a cash bonus. Now later on, if you decide to hold on to those shares and then sell them, any profit or loss, so the difference between the sale price and the price on your vesting date, that gets treated as a capital gain or loss. 2 separate events, 2 totally different tax treatments.
And here's a really important technical point, especially for those of you who've dealt with other kinds of equity. You cannot make what's called an 83B election on RSUs. That's a tax strategy where you can sometimes pay tax up front on the value when you're granted the stock. But because the IRS sees RSUs as just a promise, not actual property before they vest, that option is completely off the table. You have to wait until the vesting date to pay the tax, period.
All right, so we've covered the mechanics. Now, let's put on our strategist hats and really analyze the trade-offs here. What are the actual upsides and downsides, not just for the employee getting the grant, but for the company that's issuing it?
So looking at the pros, they're obviously a great tool for keeping people around, and they almost always have some value. For employers, they're pretty cheap to administer, and they help delay diluting the shares. Now, on the flip side, for employees, you get no dividends or voting rights before the shares actually vest. And there's that huge forfeiture risk. If you leave before your vesting date, you walk away from the rest of that money. And like we just said, not being able to use an 83B election can be a real tax disadvantage.
All right, let's move to our final section, and this is where it all comes together. We're going to tackle the most common point of confusion by putting RSUs in a head-to-head matchup with stock options.
Okay, the difference here is absolutely fundamental. An RSU is an outright award of stock. A stock option is just the right to buy stock at a fixed price later on. And this leads to the most critical difference of all: value. RSUs keep their value even if the stock price tanks, as long as it's not zero. Stock options, on the other hand, can become completely worthless if the stock price drops below your exercise price. You've probably heard the term for that. It's called being underwater.
So, to put this all into a real-world context, just look at this number, 104,619. This isn't just some random number. That's how many RSUs Tesla's CFO received in a recent grant. This just grounds the whole idea in the high-stakes world of executive pay, where a grant like this represents enormous potential wealth and, believe me, a massive incentive to perform.
So, when you boil it all down, what is the strategic role of the RSU? Well, it's a mechanism that's designed to perfectly align the financial interests of an employee with the success of the company. It has become one of the most popular, one of the most effective tools out there for holding on to top talent and for sharing a piece of the pie with the very people who are responsible for building it.
And that brings us to our final thought. Now that you have this framework, you understand the mechanics, the tax rules, the strategic pros and cons, how does this change your perspective? The next time you see an RSU grant as part of a job offer, what new questions are you going to ask? What new calculations are you going to make? That is the real takeaway from this briefing. Thanks for your time.